Well, welcome to the Trainers Bullpen, where trainers in the law enforcement space come to hear the experts talk about their work, their experience, and research into human performance, particularly as it relates to the critical aspects of training, motor learning, and adaptive decision-making. The purpose of the Trainers Bullpen is to help bridge the gap between law enforcement training and the findings of academic research and current pedagogical best practice. Our desire at the Trainers Bullpen is to help advance law enforcement training, to make research applied, and improve officer and public safety. The Trainers Bullpen is a production of Raptor Protection, and I'm Chris Butler, your host. And today it's my pleasure to welcome to the show Brian Moon. Brian is the Chief Technology Officer at Perigean Technologies and a leading practitioner and researcher in the field of naturalistic decision-making, or NDM. His work focuses on understanding and enabling proficient performance across many domains. His publications include chapters in the Cambridge Handbook of Expertise and Expert Performance, the Oxford Handbook of Expertise. He is the co-founder of the Cognitive Task Analysis, or CTA Institute, the world's only training curriculum for cognitive task analysis, and is the executive director of the Natural Decision-Making Association. Mr. Moon holds a Master's of Science in Sociology from the London School of Economics. Brian, welcome to the Trainers Bullpen.
Great. Appreciate it, Chris. Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, absolutely. I was excited to talk to you, Brian. I was thankful for Dr. Joel Suss, who I think it was a month or so ago, introduced us on Gmail and said, you need to have Brian on to the Trainers Bullpen to talk about his experience and research into naturalistic decision-making and how we should understand and apply those principles to law enforcement. So, of course, that piqued my interest because law enforcement officers operate often in situations where they're enshrouded in a cloud of uncertainty, ambiguity, rapidly unfolding circumstances, and high consequence outcomes. So if there's ever a place where we can look at how could we help improve decision making in law enforcement, we're all over that. So Brian, why don't you start out a little bit telling us about yourself and your background and journey into decision making?
Sure. Appreciate it. The journey, I guess, really started in undergraduate. I attended Miami University in Oxford, Ohio. I got a psychology degree, and while I was there, had been interested in things like new religious movements and cults. And at the time that I was at Miami, the ATF raid on the Branch Davidians, which later was handed off to the FBI, was in full swing and executed the whole time I was at Miami. And so that got me very, very interested in sort of the engagement and interaction between law enforcement and new religions. And at the time, a professor at the London School of Economics, Eileen Barker, who had been offering a master's degree for a couple of decades in the sociology of religion, finally convinced the LSE to also put together a program on new religions. She herself was an expert in cults, and just happened to coincide with with my interest in my independent study at Miami into basically what happened at Waco. And my professor who I was taking that independent study with, again, just happened to come across the announcement for this program at the LSE and pass it along to me. And next thing I knew, I was on my way to London and had an amazing year there. London's great for a lot of things, but if you're interested in studying cults, it's the place to be because everybody's got an outpost there. So did a lot of naturalistic research there in talking to people in new religions of all kinds and all varieties. And the way the program was set up, there was each master's student sort of takes two main courses. I, of course, was taking the new religious movements, and the other one that I took was in deviant behavior or criminology. And so, again, that interest in both sides of the issue, that is the cults and what their members go through, and then also police work and what police officers go through. That was my academic interest. When I came back to the States, I settled in D.C. I actually did apply for the FBI. I was rejected, and I don't mind sharing the reason that I think I was rejected. Well, the obvious reason is I didn't have any law enforcement experience. But I think also I like to envision that there was somebody on the other end reading my application, because in the section where the request was, do you speak any foreign languages? I said I speak other, and I said I speak Bible babble. because that was the phrase that the FBI would use in trying to negotiate with and talk to David Koresh at the Branch Davidians. He's just speaking a bunch of Bible babble, right? And so I suppose someone could have read the Bible babble and not appreciated my tongue-in-cheek response to the application. In any event, I was not selected for the FBI. I've had a number of projects actually over the years with, in particular, the Behavioral Sciences Unit at the FBI. So I've maintained an interest. And to your point about what police work is all about, yes, it is definitely one of the sort of core domains, if you will. I think when I think of NDM is people making split-second decisions that have major consequence for people's lives. All the different pressures that come into making those decisions are very present in law enforcement work. To continue the journey, in 2000 went to work for Gary Klein's company. Gary Klein is regularly cited as the person mainly responsible for establishing naturalistic decision-making as a field. Work on the recognition prime decision-making model is core for understanding what NDM is all about. So I worked for Gary and his company in Ohio for about 7 years. And then a lot of that time, by the way, was spent working with folks in the intelligence community, which, of course, in some places sits side saddle with law enforcement. A lot of work because this was, right after 9/11, and there was a lot of interest in sort of helping analysts, at least ostensibly helping them, but rather, some of the language was we're gonna fix the way that analysts make mistakes, and so a lot of those proposed solutions were technology solutions, and so there was a lot of effort going into how do we use some of these emerging technologies, digital technologies, to help analysts be better, more accurate, faster, all those sorts of things. So I did a lot of work in that area while I was at Gary's company. And Gary eventually, he and his partners sold their company to a defense contractor who I worked for a couple of years as well. But around 2007, sort of decided I was interested in having my own client associates like company, which I was not. It was not an original thought. Gary's company, before he sold it, we were up to about 35 or so people. Out of Gary's company sprang 15 other small companies, folks like myself, who not only sort of learned what NDM's all about, but also learned how to run small businesses and do government and commercial contract work. So there's a bunch of us out there who do this sort of thing. Along the way, also continuing to be involved just in the NDM community more broadly. And I actually met Joel Suss, speaking of him. I guess it's probably been 10 or so years ago when he was the host of one of the NDM conferences. And we decided a few years ago to formalize NDM and form an association around it so people felt like they had a home who were otherwise in the diaspora of NDM researchers and practitioners. So over the past couple of years, we've been consolidating resources and networks and building up the association to get broader exposure of NDM, help people understand what it's all about, help people do NDM, which is kind of a weird thing to say, but bringing theory and methods to work in practical ways is what we NDMers have been trying to do for a while, but we know that there's only so many of us going around, and so ideally NDM can become a way that people think about the way people make decisions and how they train to help people make better and faster decisions. So we've also been thinking quite a bit, especially lately, about how do we push some of what we know and what we do out into the world so that others can do it, even if they don't formally call themselves NDMers. So that's the journey, and still in the day-to-day trying to figure out how to make all this work.
Awesome. And you mentioned just a minute ago, you used the phrase the diaspora of NDM decision makers. So maybe that's a good place to start, Brian. Like, help us understand, for those of us who haven't heard much about naturalistic decision making, or we're exploring this, Like, what is naturalistic decision making, and then what sets it apart, or is it like a contrary or a different way of looking at decision making from what is traditionally thought? And so help us just understand that framework of decision making.
Yeah, diaspora. That's probably me speaking from my own personal experience as as somebody who came from Klein Associates, and a bunch of us sort of left and start up our own companies. But actually the better way to look at it is exactly what you said, sort of a reaction to traditional or popular, or however you want to say that, decision making research that's been around for a while. So you can look at Gary's story and sort of realize what happened, but that story actually got repeated in many ways and by many people. In fact, we also do our own podcast on the naturalistic decisionmaking.org site, where we have talked to about 50 people who are NDM affiliated, or in some cases, founders of the movement, or big names in the field. And what's most amazing is a lot of their stories sound very similar. And the gist of the plot basically goes, I wanted to understand people and how they make decisions, and got interested in psychology, and was trained to set up surveys or experiments or other ways of sort of bringing the world into a lab somewhere, giving college kids pizza money and have them work on some task. And that was supposed to help me figure out how people make decisions. That story has been repeated over and over again by people who eventually found their way to NDM. And it's the same story actually that Gary has, because he was a trained experimental psychologist, and in his early days, got a project funded by the Department of Defense to understand what command decision making looks like. What do folks who are in a command position, how do they make decisions? And so Gary sort of went looking for this sort of thing. Couldn't at the time figure out how to get close to actual defense commanders, and so used a proxy of fireground commanders, because there were more of them. They were closer to home, where he was in Dayton, Ohio. And so he could go work with those folks and presumably glean something out of what they do that would be relevant to what a commander of defense forces would do. And so he went looking, but unfortunately, when you go looking for decisions, it can be kind of an inefficient process, especially when you're working with firefighters, because you're waiting for fires to happen, right? And so so that means sitting around and doing a lot of nothing. And so what he kind of started to realize is, well, why don't I spend my time actually talking to them about fires they've been involved with in the past? So thinking more of a way to collect data as a way to get retrospective about it. So people have done these things, and so you can talk to them about what they did. You can also observe them doing it if you are lucky enough to be in that situation. But, like I said, that's going to be an inefficient way to do this. So Gary kind of realized he's going to have to do it a little bit differently, and that's where you'd mentioned the CTA Institute. That's where a lot of those cognitive task analysis methods came from, sort of adapting and adopting other approaches that were in anthropology and related fields of folks who were getting out there and seeing how it's done in the real world. So that's the method side of it. The model side of it, or the theory side of it, was that Gary sort of went looking for how is it that commanders look at information and take it all in and weigh it and compare it and think about the options they could pursue and think about, the consequences of those options and compare them all to each other and, set up things like multi-attribute utility analysis, but lay it all out, right? The whole information space. And when he started talking to people, none of them were talking about that. They didn't really conceive of their work as consisting of that sort of thing. They just said, we kind of know what to do when we show up, and we do it. And they would use words like, I guess I just have ESP, right? Extrasensory perception. And so it all sounded kind of mystical and magical. But when Gary really started digging into the questions that he had and get the answers that they were given, what he started to realize is it's not really about that. It's about decision making that is about taking the situation and comparing it to the experiences that you've had to see if it seems familiar, like you've been in this situation before, or you can kind of see some attributes of this situation which remind you of other situations you've been in or that other people have been in and told you about. So sizing up the situation, what do I think is really going on here? And once you have a handle on that, again, if you have experience, you can then think about the things that worked before, and if they're going to work here, try to implement them. If they're not going to work here, can you tweak them and make them work here? And so I'm basically just describing Gary's recognition prime decision making model, which is basically about size up the situation, bring your experience to bear, both on sizing up the situation and then trying to figure out serially, right? So one option that I might try, if that's going to work, great, do it. If not, let's try the second option, which is a very different approach than saying, let's lay out all the options and compare them to each other. Right. So that's really where the efficiency of all this comes in. And that's how people with experience are able to quickly size up situations and figure out what needs to be done. And we've seen that over and over again in all sorts of domains, law enforcement, healthcare. I've worked with a lot of Fortune 500 consumer companies, and the same thing happens there. Right. People have problems. They try out solutions that they think are going to work. They get rid of the ones that don't, and then they implement, which of course raises new problems for them. But just that process of figuring out what's going on and implementing what you think is going to work is the way people make decisions.
Now, is it your experience with when you have performers in domains that are like where there's time compression, exigency to respond, high consequence potential outcomes, is naturalistic decision making, is it more prevalent, like in Gary's work with overground fire commanders? Is it in those types of domains where you just don't have time? Like, even hypothetically, if you were to lay out all the possible options and weigh them and consider them, but in these types of environments where you have to respond in a second or fractions of a second with the first information that becomes available, are these the types of domains where really naturalistic decision making is like powerfully used?
Yeah, early on in Gary's work, they had a couple projects to explore exactly that kind of question. What's the relative occurrence, if you will, of people doing RPD versus doing some other more analytic, approach to making decisions. The research was pretty clear. Just by counting what people do, they could determine that, yes, certainly in those time pressured situations where there really isn't time to go through all the options in the analysis, yes, you're going to see more of that. But the surprising thing is, even outside of that, you still see the same sort of thing, right? So we've, Gary and colleagues back in the day did some projects like figuring out how people choose laundry detergent, right? And it wasn't necessarily standing in the aisle and comparing all the options and that sort of thing. It was based more on their experience with one or another product or, some marketing campaign they had seen. And so, again, we see this sort of thing over and over again. Yes, absolutely. In time-pressured situations, everyone who has experience is going to go with their gut, as we say, or their intuitions, and usually that kind of works out. But the same goes for people, experienced drivers, right? Everybody has to drive, and so you're kind of doing the same sort of thing. Now, all of this is not to say that those analytic approaches aren't going to be helpful, because they are. One of Gary's kind of long-term adversarial collaborators was Daniel Kahneman, the Nobel Prize-winning economist who had, written Thinking Fast and Slow, and he also addressed this sort of thing in that book. He and Gary wrote an article which was titled sort of Failure to Disagree. And the idea is basically, yes, when you have the experience and even in time pressure situations, then go with that. If you have more time to do the analysis, then those analytic tools can be helpful. But under the hood, even those analytic approaches are going to require people to make intuitive decisions, right? What data am I going to use? Where do I think that data is coming from? If I get the data and it looks weird, why does it look weird to me, right? What analytic method should I choose? What workarounds do I have to make that analytic method work with the data that I have? So even within those, careful, analytic type approaches where the method is supposed to be laid out for you, you'll see these places where you're just supposed to make judgments. And people who have experience can make those judgments, and people who don't have experience, it's paralysis. They don't really know how to do the analysis to begin with because they think it's just data meets analytics and you move forward. But there's so much more that goes into it. And that's the sort of thing we would see a lot in the intelligence community, right? It's not really about technology and coming up with an algorithm to crunch the data. It's about everything I just said. It's about the data, where they come from and where they might be in error, where the provenance may not be what you think it is, what data actually might be trying to deliberately mislead you, right? Tools don't know that sort of thing. People know that sort of thing, and they build that experience space up to help them recognize that kind of issue.
Awesome. Now, this phrase, like you use the terms gut feel or intuition. So are you referring to like it's something called, would that be like implicit or tacit knowledge that experts have that they are just applying? So whatever's unfolding in front of them, they're obviously recognizing some types of cues that are being present. And so at the naturalistic decision-making level, then, are those cues somehow being compared to that tacit or implicit knowledge, or how is that connection being made to recognize what's happening?
Yeah, we do use a lot of terms interchangeably, but I think recognition is probably the best term to use, right? You recognize something because it's familiar, and you gain that familiarity by the experience, and so it's a yin yang sort of thing. But we say things like implicit or tacit knowledge. To us, that just means the sorts of things that people know, and while they might not necessarily even in the moment be able to articulate what it is they're paying attention to or what it means to them, they still know it and they're still able to take action on it. Cognitive task analysis is one of our approaches for helping them make the inexplicit explicit, right? So that we can get it out of their head, if you will, and share it with others. So yeah, tacit knowledge and explicit knowledge, to me, it's just all that experience that you've got, right? And it has put you in a disposition, if you will, to recognize things. And this isn't anything that's unnatural or mystical or anything like that. It's just what people do, right? It's just what we're equipped to do, and it's just how we learn, and it's just how people operate, right? We have these senses, but along with these senses, we have ideas and theories in our head, and those help us to focus on the things that matter for that particular situation, right? And close out everything else. Now, what we see when we work with more novice people in a given domain is they're struggling to figure that out, right? They don't know necessarily where to focus. They don't know if something is important because it seems important or it is actually important, right? They just can't make those fine discriminations in their environment. And that's what experience buys you is, I missed that last time, or somebody told me that was important, but I didn't think about it last time, right? Now I'm going to think about it because I'm seeing it this time.
And, as you're talking there, what just popped into my mind, I was thinking about eye tracking studies that I've seen done with police officers, novice police officers, and expert performers, where scenes are unfolding in front of them. And one of the things that really stands out to me in those the differences between novices and experts is just what you said with the eye trackers. We see novices, their eye tracking is all over the place. They don't know
Right.
where to put their focus of attention in the scene, whereas experts is exactly the opposite. It seems they have this ability to separate signal from noise. Like in all of the stimulus that's coming in, they just seem to gate it out and just anticipate, actually, even if the cue isn't present in the scene, it's almost like they're expecting it. And not only are they expecting it, like they're expecting it geographically, like where it's going to occur, and also temporally, when it's going to occur and what it looks like when it does. So with those types of studies, are what we're looking at there, Brian, is that are we sort of getting under the hood, to use your terminology, and seeing what's going on at a brain level with like that implicit recognition knowledge?
Yeah. You had me up until that last point about the brain piece. We don't yet know a lot of how this actually works with regard to our physical capabilities, but everything else you said, absolutely agree. And I'm really glad you brought up the geographic and the temporal piece, because a lot of what makes something important is seeing it play out over time, right? This was not here yesterday. Right? Or I'm usually expecting people to be on the street at 3 o'clock and there's no one out. Well, where is everybody? Right? So we recognize situations over time, not just in the immediate visual, but we use all of our other senses. We use information that we got from sources we trust, and frankly, sources we don't trust as another cue. So cues can also be in the negative sense. I'm not seeing this, and I should be, or this person's saying that, and I know that that person has lied in the past. Right? These are all things that police officers have to pay attention to, and over time, they learn how, because they become familiar with not only police work and protocols and that sort of thing, but the environments that they are working in, right? The people that they engage with on a day-to-day basis. And that includes their fellow officers. It includes, folks who have a stakeholder interest in policing, and it certainly includes the general public. And so all these things we see, again, in lots of different domains. One of the interesting studies that the folks at Klein Associates were engaged in early on in some of our, I say more recent, in our last 25 years of warfighting, what you start to see is an interest from the military in things called, goes by various names, but operations other than war, right? And you start to see people interested in the fact that you're not only talking about tactics and how to quell or maybe aggravate situations, but you're now thinking about that camera that you're seeing on top of the building, and maybe that camera person that you're also noticing, right? So that's people taking into consideration aspects of war that previous generations didn't really have to do. And so all of that environmental piece is going to be changing over time, especially when it has to do with information. And again, seeing this sort of thing play out over time is exactly what we mean by critical cues that are happening in the environment. And it's all continuous, right? This isn't just in the moment, I'm going to stop everything and make these considerations. All this stuff is dynamic. All these situations change in ways that people expect, in ways that they don't expect. People get surprised. But I think the other important thing you talked about was this idea of anticipation, right? So it's not just, I see this cue and I know what it means. It's, I see the trajectory of this situation and I can envision where it might start to go really badly unless we do certain things. So yeah, it's very, very much a forward-looking sort of carve out your plans, even as your plans are changing and your goals are not just changing, but sometimes it's very vague, right? We would always kind of joke with each other when we would go interview folks in the military, and we'd sort of ask them, so what was your goal at this point? And, the goal is to win the war, right? But you've got so many sub goals under that constantly change and compete with that very high level goal. And so even just thinking about what does it mean to have a goal in this kind of work can be a very difficult thing to get out of people.
Now, you mentioned that, so when experts are using, so they're making great decisions, let's say, and using that recognition and the tacit knowledge that they have, it seems to me, at least like in this, a lot of the years that I spent doing training with police officers, very high fidelity type of training, and you'd put officers in and they'd go through a scenario and respond very well, make great decisions. And then at the end of it, you're doing basically a debriefing. And what I noticed is very often officers, even though they made great decisions, they really struggled to be able to articulate what it is that they saw, what it meant, and why. Like, they know what they did, but they just struggle to articulate it. And this becomes really problematic, Brian, in the judicial system, because as an expert witness, it's one of the challenges that officers face. And one of my challenges as an expert witness is trying to pull out of officers what actually did you see? What were the significant cues? What did they mean? How did that impact your risk assessment? And they really struggle to take something that is implicit and make it explicit. And that's horrible in that domain, because the judicial system is entirely set up around the reasonableness and the articulation of the officer's actions after an event that maybe took 30 seconds to occur.
Right.
So help us understand that. Why is it that experts struggle to be able to make that explicit and to articulate it?
Yeah. There's a lot to this issue. I want to go back to the first part of what you said, which is making great decisions. Experience does not equate to infallibility.
Right.
Experts make errors all the time, and even the most experienced folks can commit errors. What I've noticed in working with people with a lot of experience in a variety of domains is that for someone who has reached an expert level of performance, they think about those errors all the time. And often, when we start to talk to them, they want to go back and relive those errors with us, right? Because those are such seminal moments in their career and on their journey toward expertise that it's kind of help what made them what they are, right? And so we always want to be careful when we're talking about experts in the NDM community. Expertise doesn't necessarily equate with with infallibility, and that's an important conversation for us to continue to lead, because there are other approaches and tools and forces out there that are purporting to have some sort of access to perfection. A lot of the artificial intelligence tools, for instance, the folks who hype those up will tell you that they're going to overcome human decision making at some point. Well, they're just as riddled with errors, and in some cases even worse errors than people are going to make. So that's the first part of it. The second part, I think, is also an important conversation for our community to lead, because we do think we have the tools to help the articulation problem. And it is a problem, like you're saying, because in this domain and in others, how people reasoned through a situation, got themselves into a situation and out of it, can be an extremely important part of how that whole domain operates. And what we do with cognitive task analysis is, I look at it as sort of scaffolding people to articulate what they already know. Right. I don't know how they got through that situation, but I'm going to spend as much time as they'll give me to continue to ask them questions in a structured way that helps them get inside their own head and think about what they were thinking about at the time, what they were seeing, smelling, hearing at the time, what those cues meant to them, what cues were not there that should have been there, those expectations we talked about, how their goals changed over time. The sort of big hammer for us is a method that we call the critical decision method, and it is an incident-based retrospective method whereby we're asking experts in a given field, can you tell us about a time when your experience, your expertise became an important part of, and ideally sort of was the cause of the outcome of an incident. That outcome could be good or bad, but we want to know specifically about those times when you did something that had some sort of effect on an outcome. And people with deep experience have a million of these things in their head. Sometimes it's actually hard for them to pick one because, they want to know what you want to know about. We see that a lot in doing these interviews with police officers. We see it also in healthcare, in particular with nurses who are dealing with, a dozen patients a day. Do you want to know about one last week, or do you want to know the one 2 years ago that I still think about? But the point is, we are going into excruciating detail with them to bring them back to those moments, to back up and think about the context in which this situation even came about, to get deep into the moment, in the moments leading up to, and get them thinking about all those cues, factors, background knowledge they had, what their training had suggested they do, and how what they did was different from their training, and then talk about all of the information around the outcome, right? To include, how do you now think about that situation? So that's the toolkit of cognitive task analysis that enables us in the NDM community to do this with people. And I've interviewed literally hundreds of people over the course of my career, and CDM is by far and away the most useful method for doing it. It's a structured method in that the person who's doing the interviewing knows to go after the story, but it feels very much just like an interview, and some people have even said mine feel like an interrogation, right? I know that the story, the structure is there, but I also have a lot of really great questions that I and others before me have used that really help people to understand what it is we're after, right? And so we ask them about, what was the big picture you were trying to think about here? What were you noticing or not noticing? What would someone who was new to this job have completely missed? Right. So we have a bunch of these questions which are kind of generic, but they get at those aspects of expertise that we know expert performers demonstrate. Big picture noticing, anticipatory thinking, as we were talking about earlier. So that's what cognitive task analysis really is. It's a suite of structured interview approaches with a lot of really great questions that enable us to talk to people in any domain and get an insightful story that we can then do something with.
Okay, so whether we're looking at trying to understand what somebody did following an incident, so that cognitive task analysis, that structure would be helpful in that, or is that the same structure that, say, a trainer, law enforcement trainer, wants to build a training environment, a learning environment to accelerate that expertise? So we don't want them to learn from the school of hard knocks if we can avoid it. We want them to learn in the learning environment. So is that the starting point, Brian, as to do you do that cognitive task analysis with your experts in your domain and pull out those critical factors and then use that to develop your learning, or how does that work?
Yeah, you got it. I mean, that's the big that's the big strategy. I don't care if somebody else learns from somebody else's school of hard knocks, even better, right? Yeah. Because we're just making the whole process more efficient, and we don't have to go through the pain. So we get these stories about people's experience and working through these incidents that are important and critical in their domain. That gives us two things. That gives us all those cues and factors, why this particular part of the task was difficult, what strategies they might have used in that moment. So we get all the juicy details. But the other thing we get is a story, which means we have a scenario that we can use for training. I'll come back to the training thing in a minute. There are other applications of this. So if you are trying to build a system to include software, but also an organization or a group of people, if you're trying to build a system, the data also from these types of interviews can be extremely useful in figuring out what that system should look like, how it should operate, what conditions under which it might struggle, and where you need to figure out how to overcome those struggles. So by and large, what comes out of NDM in terms of applications is definitely training. That's a huge thing for us, but also system design and evaluation, right? So again, back to my work with the intelligence community, a lot of that work was, I now understand what analysts are going to struggle with. So let's look at your tool. And before we even throw it in the mix, let's think about what your tool's trying to accomplish and how it does that, and how someone's going to use it, because that can already up front tell us a lot about what we think is going to happen with this tool. Is it going to work or not? Right? We've got a really good platform to run some, even just some, in the head sort of testing to see, is this going to work? What parts of what the analysts are doing is this actually going to disable? Right? And so out of decades of doing that kind of work, our community also has kind of principles about ways to design good systems, especially software systems that support people's cognitive and collaborative work. Right? We know where all the pitfalls are. Right? We know that really expert analysts are going to want to see raw data. They're not going to want to see data mixed together and filtered through some algorithm. That's not going to be helpful to them. In fact, it could very much disable them, especially when they don't know the data's been mixed. Right? They're looking at something thinking it's raw data. Well, it's already been filtered and processed by some other tool, and so it gets to them, and they don't have that same provenance they expect to have. Right? So we know also about building systems and evaluating systems that are already in place. We also know about designing organizations and enhancing the design of the organization so that it both enables expert performance and enables junior people to get more quickly up to expert level performance. Right? We know about how work should be organized, for instance, and how teams should be organized and what sorts of activities they should do to get more quickly up to a high-performing team. One of my favorite projects I always like to talk about was working with an architecture and a design company to redesign the White House Situation Room. It's been through a lot of redesigns over the years, but I was involved in one while I was still working with Gary's company, and it hadn't been redesigned, I think, since the 60s, and so at that point, it's a historic space. You can't knock down walls, right? But they're trying to accomplish a lot of stuff in there. The president and his principals discussing, in a conference room sort of way, but there's analysts also working in that space. There's communication going on in that space. So bringing this kind of perspective to thinking about how physical spaces can be designed is just another application. And I think the application you suggested earlier, which is, in legal work, right? In trying to understand what really somebody thought about what they were trying to accomplish, what their, we talk a lot about intent in the law, but it's also very much about what someone thought was going on. And so I see as a terrific potential application of these kinds of techniques as well. But by and large, we in the NDM community are concerned with that twofold problem I mentioned a minute ago, which is how do we help experts get better? And how do we more quickly get junior people up to speed? And so a lot of my work under my company over the years has been in working with experts in the event that that expert might no longer be with the organization. Right? So the organization's already thinking about this person's about to retire in 5 years, and we don't actually know all the work that they do, and we certainly are not inside their head to figure out how they do it. And so we have a practice we call expertise management, which is all about, knowledge management brings a whole lot of baggage with it as a term and as a practice. But our suggestion is if you're going to do any kind of knowledge and you're knowledge management in your organization, you might as well focus on the most important knowledge out there, which is the expertise that those very senior people have. And so that's why, I've been working with folks in nuclear engineering and pet food production and, the railroads to try to better understand how those senior people are working. Because when those people leave the organization, everybody feels it. There's a tremendous gap in the capability of the organization, both in terms of the work that needs to get done, but also lost opportunities that those experts would have seen coming. So again, just another idea for application of all this work. But the training piece is where we're all, it's where a lot of us work, and it's where a lot of us are able to quickly see the results and the value of all this, because we see those light bulbs turn on in people's heads. We see, perspectives shift. We see people being very quickly able to get to levels of performance that traditional training just simply can't bring them to.
I'm so glad you mentioned that expertise piece in the organization, because I think it's one of the things, well, at least speaking personally from my own organization that I spent 30 years with, is you see very senior police members, and that doesn't mean senior officers, but senior police members. They may be senior officers, but I'm thinking of even frontline officers that I know that have worked the street for 25 years as a patrol officer. What incredible experience that they have. And they leave the organization with all of that being untapped and unlearned from. And also very senior incident commanders and senior officers, like you said, they leave the organization, and then you wonder, why does the police agency struggle so bad to become a high reliability organization when they have not tapped into all of that expertise that has been developed over those years? So I'm glad you mentioned that, because I certainly see that as such a valuable role for this whole cognitive task analysis and being able to capture that expertise. Brian, you used the phrase, the story elicitation technique, to be able to capture that. Can you talk a little bit more about that? Like when you're talking to somebody to pull out that expertise, what does that look like? What does that conversation look like?
It looks like a conversation. If someone's really good at doing CTA, it looks like a conversation, right? But the structure is pretty straightforward. So depending on the goals of the project, we will ask people to share up to 3 stories in a very bite-sized way, the Cliff Notes version, that meet the criteria for the project. So if I am trying to understand how police officers deal with domestic situations, for instance, I want to know 3 domestic incidents that were particularly challenging for that person, and ideally that had a good outcome, but not necessarily, and that they will feel comfortable sharing, are allowed to share, and preferably, but not necessarily, are fairly recent in their experience. Some people, I have never been ceased to amaze how far back people can reach and the exquisite level of detail that they're able to produce out of their memory. But those are really the criteria we're looking for. Tell us something that was important and meaningful, and where you, whoever I'm talking to, you were intimately involved in the outcome. Sometimes people sort of, they'll want to share a war story that happened to somebody else because it was interesting, but that's not what we want to know. We want to know from their perspective, because we're going to be trying to get the first person perspective from them. So we usually ask for a couple of those up front, and then again, depending on the goals of the project, we usually pick the one that seems most interesting. And then what we want them to do is to sort of lay out the bigger picture of the story. So they've already kind of given us the Cliff Notes version, but now we really want to kind of lay that out basically in a timeline. And then as we're going through that timeline, what we are listening to as CTA practitioners is where are the decision points or the judgment points or places in this story where they did something that affected the trajectory of the story. All right, so we're trying to listen for that. We're not asking them about that in the moment. We just want them to keep going with the story and lay it all out for us. Because what we're going to do next is come back to all those decision points and go back through it in painstaking detail, right? So we're going to go all the way back to the beginning, maybe even a bit before that, because, people tell stories in lots of different ways, but they tell stories based on their immediate recollection and also what they think you want to hear, right? And so they're going to start somewhere. But what we're looking for as a CTA practitioner is, what's the context? How do we even get in this situation to begin with? And so sometimes we have to even back them up even further to talk about the introduction and the preface to the story, right? So we can really ground this whole thing in the context, because what's most important coming out of these stories, again, is a story from the perspective of the person that we're interviewing, but also has all that rich detail of the context, because that context detail is going to be what they paid attention to as they were moving through the story. And so we just keep going, and we keep cycling through and cycling back and diving deeper. All along the way, we are listening for, people say it in lots of different ways, but especially where they say, well, I just kind of knew how to do that. Or that comes with experience. Or, I've done that before. Okay, well, there are ding, ding, ding red flags going off in our head when we hear those kinds of prompts, because that's the place where we start digging. And again, that's what I mean by the structure. So it's those sweeps, if you will, through the story. The questions or the probes that we ask are the ways that we think about things like an RPD model and hear them talking through an RPD model, even though they're not saying, here's my RPD model, they're just telling you a story, right? But in the back of our heads, we're thinking, oh, this is where they were mentally simulating their course of action, right? And so we want to know, did you consider any other courses of action, right? Because the one they're going to tell us about in the story is the one that happened, not the ones that they thought through, right? So we want to know all the other ones they thought through, and we want to know why they didn't go with those. Right. So to your point earlier about, getting in somebody to articulate, that's what's hard about it. Because, again, people tell stories all the time, and generally they tell the details of the story that they think matter. And frankly, the ones that make them look best, right? The ones that turned out well, and, share and see stories and war stories and water cooler stories. That's the story people are going to tell. But we want to know the whole story. We want to know not just what they did, but what they considered doing that they decided not to do, and why they decided that was not the right thing to do. So that's the depth and the detail that we're trying to go through.
And as you mine those points, like you say, and you go through those layers, are the people you're talking to, do they become like surprised in actually how much more information they're able to recall and offer as you keep hitting those points and going deeper and deeper?
Yes, absolutely. People who are very experienced in their domain are often very humble about their work. And, they'll say something up front like, well, I don't know, because we try to reserve time with them, right? I don't know how you're going to get 2 hours out of this conversation, right? And then 2.5 hours later, they're saying, wow, we've been talking for 2.5 hours. I can't believe I remembered all that stuff. Yeah. So to me, that's why I referred to it earlier as a scaffolding exercise, right? We're just trying to get them to think about what they experience, because it's all in there. We just got to help them kind of bring it out. And that's why it's a facilitated exercise. People could do this sort of thing on their own, but it requires kind of knowing how to do CTA in order to get it out of your own head, which is why a lot of people who are former or current operators who are trying to do training, they just miss so much of what could be trained because they just don't think to put it in the training, right? They hit those high points and they hit those protocols and they hit the procedures that they followed, but really something else probably happened. And so that's the stuff that doesn't make its way into training, which is why we try to put it in there.
Yeah, I really like what I'm hearing, Brian. I think that this approach would really help law enforcement agencies because we do so much scenario-based training and high-fidelity training, whatever you want to call it. But really, what are you grounding the content of your scenarios on? And I think if you're not going out into the field and pulling out these stories from your experts that are actually going to these calls and managing them and
Right.
taking that information that you would capture through your critical task analysis or your cognitive task analysis.
Yeah.
Like, to stick with your example of the domestics, I think that's a great one. So let's say you came to my agency, Brian, and you interviewed 15 or 20 of my most senior frontline officers on their attendance at domestic disputes. And so you did your cognitive task analysis and you got your bucket of information. How would you then take that into the training environment and begin to now build? Would it be actual practical scenarios? Would it be tabletop exercises? Like, what's the scope of how you would take that information and now help accelerate expertise in other officers?
Yeah, there's a couple of ways that we go about it. And I say things about traditional training that might sound like I'm sort of poo-pooing on traditional training. Simply sharing what those critical cues are can be one way to do traditional training that can be extremely helpful. It's just that with our data, those critical cues are more voluminous and they are more important than people will generally present in a training exercise, right? Again, a lot of training out there is focused on, what protocol should I follow? What rule does that come from? And how am I supposed to do it? Right. But then you read between the lines and there's a bunch of judgments in there you have to make and a bunch of things you have to figure out that you weren't trained on. And so one approach is to just take all those data points that we've learned about and present them, right? That's kind of a traditional training model, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. We would just prefer that the stuff that comes out of our interviews be included in that set of information that people are getting. Another way is, as you mentioned, the scenario-based training. We do a lot of that. We develop it. Sometimes we deliver it. And that is about wrapping together in a sort of amalgamation way a bunch of different stories, right? So that the scenario can take twists and turns and it's not just one story. But along the way, we stop that story and say, okay, what would you do now? You've got the information we've given you. You don't have all the information because we withheld some of it, but you've got the information we've given you. What would you do, or what would you prepare at this point to do, or what would your next steps be, or what's concerning you? So we're still asking some of those cognitive task analysis questions. And so this is what we call decision games. Joel and others do a lot of this sort of thing as well. The Marine Corps has been using it forever. It goes way back in terms of, a way to do learning for this sort of level of performance. And so I've done them in tactical scenarios. I've done them with Fortune 500 companies to think about how they're going to roll out their next project by exploring what went wrong in the last one, right? So what we're trying to do is to that point we made earlier about letting other people learn ostensibly through other people's experience. That's exactly what we're trying to do.
Yeah.
And so another way to introduce all this stuff is if you have already high fidelity training, we talk about cognitive fidelity, right? Mm-hmm. So if you've got the digital versions or you've got physical versions of doing training, make sure that some of the things that we're learning about from the experts get wrapped into that training as well, right? And a lot of times in a lot of training conferences I go to, it's all about the widgets and the gadgets, and it's not a whole lot about the cognitive piece that needs to be there. I just this month in February had an article come out in TD Magazine, which is the Association for Talent Development, which is one of the world's largest training organizations. And it was an article focused on cognitive fidelity. You don't necessarily need the bells and whistles if you have the data, especially the data that those experts can bring to the table. The last thing to say about, well, maybe not the last thing, one of the last things to say about training is, we know across the board that about 60% of what people learn is on the job. Right. And so what we've been moving toward also is how do we help those mentors be better mentors, and how do we help those mentees get more out of their mentors, and trying to think about ways that we can introduce these kinds of tools into that relationship. Because the bottom line is that's where a lot of knowledge is going to get transferred, if it gets transferred, right? That's a big if. But helping those mentors to realize what they should be sharing as a mentor, not just do your best and you'll learn about it someday sort of stuff, but tell those stories and tell them in the way that we would get out of you in a CTA interview, right? And also listen to the questions that those novices are asking you, trying to figure out where their gaps in knowledge are. How can we make that happen more often? And so that's a direction we've been moving in, to take sort of the good stuff that happens in these tactical decision games, but also just push that into those conversations that people are going to have anyway.
Okay, so and I wish we had like 3 hours for this interview, Brian. I have to have you back on again because this is just so fascinating. But like with those tactical decision games or the high fidelity types of scenarios that you're running, so I'm envisioning I've taken all of that rich domestic knowledge that my officers have. I'm putting those cues and those injects into my tactical games and my scenarios. And so 2 questions arise out of that. One is, how do I get my lesser experienced officers to be aware, to recognize the significance of those cues? Like, is that something that you do through conversations beforehand? You do walkthroughs, you point out where those things are occurring, what the meaning of them are? Do you have experts talk about them, tell their stories about them before they go through scenarios? So that's question number 1. And then number 2 is, what if they miss it? Like, what if they're going through a tabletop or a tactical game or whatever it is, and there's cues there that ought to be causing them to make a decision on and to change a trajectory, but they miss the cue? Do you just let that continue and allow them to experience the consequences of missing that and then back it up and say, why did that occur? Because you missed this? Or do you pause it in the moment when they miss it and draw their attention back to it? Like, how would you do that?
Yeah, so the first part I can give a concrete example of. So we had a project with the Marine Corps. It was all about trying to defeat improvised explosive devices, which in the Marine Corps at the time was called IED defeat. And we interviewed a bunch of Marines who had, some of them had just gotten out of boot camp. Some of them had had a deployment, and some of them had had many deployments. So if you think of that as 3 different levels of experience, what we saw and the way we represented the data, you could literally see the differences between those levels, is that the people out of boot camp were telling us about what they'd heard in boot camp, right? The training they had gotten. And the way this was set up for the Marines to train in boot camp was there was a lane, and they would move down that lane as a team. And along the way, the training supervisors would put cues in the environment that they should be noticing. Wires and dead dogs and that sort of thing, right? So stuff that could tell you that there might be an IED there. Visual cues, basically. And so that's all they could do. That's literally all they could tell us about, is just parrot what they'd heard and had done in those training exercises. They literally couldn't say anything else. The folks who have been deployed were definitely still paying attention to that stuff, right? But they were also thinking, as I alluded to before, it's 3:00. There's nobody on the street. Everybody should be coming home from school right now. Where is everybody? Right? Situational types of things instead of just visual cues, right? And of course, they're gathering data from people and that sort of thing, but they're paying now more attention to the situation as it is developing than just those physical cues. The people who had been there a lot and who had, some of them even been hit by IEDs, but had also discovered some, they were absolutely thinking about all that stuff. They were also, though, thinking, how do I look as a target? If I was trying to put an IED against myself and my unit, what would I do? Right, so they've now gone well above the physical, the social. They're now thinking from an enemy perspective about themselves. Right, so that is kind of the highest level of performance you can get against that particular problem, is taking yourself completely out of your own situation and think about what you look like as a victim or a target. So that's the sort of thing that we discover in CTA. And then that's the sort of thing we can start to build back into our training exercises, right? And so how we do that, in that particular case, there was interest from the Marine Corps in using a virtual battle space to allow Marines to go in and play the insurgent against automated Marines and think about how they would get that IED together, where they would put it, the fact that they would need a guidepost so they could see exactly that the Marine's in that spot when, they've got their own visual point, they've got the Humvee, and then they've got that guidepost. And when those three things line up, that's when you hit the trigger, right? So again, just getting them to actually play the other side was quite useful in getting them to think differently about the problem. So to your other point, when and how do we introduce these sorts of things? In my mind, that's kind of up to the trainer and how the trainer wants to do it. Yes, you can stop them in the moment and say, did you see this, that, or the other thing? That's quite useful. People do that as sport coaches as well. Or you can let it play out and let them feel the consequences. Regardless of which approach you take, there definitely needs to be an after-action sort of review, or feedback, or something that has everybody given the opportunities.
Otherwise, they won't learn from it. You want to guide the learning. Yeah.
Right. And again, I mentioned earlier, sometimes we deliver this training. The best possible situation you can be in to deliver high caliber decision games is to have a trainer who is also a domain expert. And it's very hard to find those people because they don't really exist. But when you have them, they're awesome, because what they can do is also, in addition to give feedback in the moment, they can start to take the scenario in different directions based on whatever the decisions have been made, right? So it's a choose your own adventure, but they're choosing where this adventure is headed because they're starting to see the gaps that those learners are having, and they're wanting to press on those. So that's a awesome situation. And if we could do that in every training circumstance, great. But again, those people are few and far between, people who can facilitate these things, who can generate them to begin with, the scenarios and all the injects and that sort of thing. But then they can facilitate in a useful way, and they can use those injects at just the right time, or inject new ones that they hadn't even thought about, but they're starting to realize as this game's playing out, here would be a really great time to go left, that sort of thing.
Right. Okay. So, well, we've been going for over an hour already. I can't believe it. But why don't you tell us a bit more about Perigean Technologies, Brian? And you also have, I was on your website, and I saw that you have this, I guess it's a game or a skill-based model called the Plot Thinkins, not Thickens, but Thinkins. So take a few minutes to tell us about, so if listeners are interested in finding out more about how they can understand naturalistic decision-making, the cognitive task analysis, build the training from being able to pull out that critical information, tell us about Perigean Technologies and what you offer there.
Sure. Appreciate the opportunity to share. So I left Gary's company in 2007, started my own, and have been in business ever since. And everything that I've just talked about, most of it at least, I've done under my own company. Still focused on CTA, still focused on training and developing systems. So it's a model that we all have a lot of confidence in because we've seen it work so well. Also generated a lot of publications along the way, moved in a major way into this expertise management approach, which is about making sure that the company doesn't lose, or the organization doesn't lose that expertise when it walks out the door. More recently, as I mentioned, also helping to establish the NDMA and move the organization in the field further ahead. But the stuff we were just talking about it has been a particular interest recently. We were working with a veterinary hospital. They have the same problem that you see in lots of other domains, which is people come out of educational experiences, out of vet school, for instance, and they get into a situation that they didn't really cover in vet school. Emergency veterinary medicine is one of those areas, right? Because it's hard to simulate that and hard to teach it in a vet school environment. And so they were looking at ways. They had a mentorship program that they just started, but looking for ways to do NDM. How do we use some of this NDM stuff? So we developed with them, again, kind of the bread and butter play. We interviewed for their veterinary experienced doctors and developed we actually developed 4, but we ended up using 3 decision games. We didn't use that 4th one because there was some disagreement amongst the experts about the actual medical approach that they took in that case, right? So we ended up using 3. We ran their cohort of mentees through the decision games, and they loved it, and they wanted to do more. We were in the same problem we always are, which is doing more is going to take more time, resources, et cetera, et cetera. And so we started to think about, again, how do we push some of these things into environments where we are not going to be, but still get the same value out of those great CTA questions, get that crosstalk between the experts and the novices, get that going so that the experts can start to realize where those knowledge gaps are. The junior folks get to learn through that experience of those senior folks. They also learn what good questions sound like. And so when they're in other situations, they can ask those good questions. And so we were looking for ways to help that happen. And we came up with an idea collectively for the plot thinkins. It is sort of a game. We call it a decision practice, though. It's got some game components to it. The biggest component is 2 sets of cards. So what we're trying to do here is run decision games without any preparation. That is to say, there's no scenario up front. The scenario gets developed as part of the experience. So we have the group start off, usually about 6 to 10 participants, ranging ideally in experience level. One person who ideally is more experienced plays the role of the game master. They are not the facilitator. Keep that in mind. One person then is on the hot seat, and then everybody else is basically a scenario player. So we have them start off with what we call an initial dilemma. It's a generic way to set up the scenario, which is basically think about a dilemma that you've either experienced before or that you want this group to work through, right? So in law enforcement, it could be domestic incident with this, that, or the other information going in, right? You know what the initial dilemma is. That's what starts the scenario. We then have 2 decks, and we have the scenario players work with one deck, and that deck asks them to contribute new information to the scenario. So we are having them develop the scenario as we go, and the cards prompt them in different ways to add details that are more complex or that may play off another detail they just heard, or adds numeric information to the detail. So that's the scenario generation process. And then once the whole group goes around and we now have more of a scenario to work with, the person in the hot seat faces the questions. Game master asks the questions, and what they're actually asking are CTA questions. What are you thinking about right now? What are your top 3 concerns? What information do you want, and how would you go get it? Those kinds of questions. Again, the same kinds of questions we ask in CTA. The game then has them go through 3 rounds of that, so that at the end there's a pretty robust scenario. The hot seat player can switch if somebody picks the hot seat card, and then at the end we have everybody participate in something that Gary Klein has promoted over the years called the pre-mortem method. It's kind of a watered down version, but what we basically ask them to do is, if this situation keeps going in a bad direction, can everybody think why that's going to happen? So they're doing some anticipatory thinking about this situation and its potential trajectory and adding more value. So what everybody's now done is collectively shared some experience, right? Thought about what they might do in that moment. Even though the hot seat person's the person answering those questions, everybody else is hearing them. And so they're definitely thinking to themselves, well, what would I be thinking was the most important information right now? Right. So everybody collectively has participated in the experience. You didn't need any preparation. You just needed a bunch of people to show up, and you can start the exercise immediately. The other good thing is all this is generic, so we can use it in any domain. And it's a one-time purchase for the game, but you use it as much as you want. And every time you do it, the scenario's new, and the direction that it goes is a brand new experience for everybody. So we've had some really good feedback on the experience. We're going to be working with the folks at Ilita, to promote it also within law enforcement. But I've been really pleased with what we see happen, because especially with our veterinary mentees, they were sort of looking at each other, and they've been in their mentor program together for a while, but they were looking at each other and realizing, you are not in this training room right now. Your head is 2 a.m. in the emergency room, and we can see the clock ticking in there. We can see the wheels turning. And so people get a real experience out of it, and they're just using their imagination. We talked earlier about the fidelity issue. Imagination is pretty high fidelity, right? And if you can give people a structure, give them the right kinds of questions, you'll get a great experience out of it. It's not real world in the sense that it's not a scenario that has happened, right? You're coming up with it, but everybody's drawn on their same real world experience. And so in some ways you're mixing a lot of experience together.
Awesome. And so the plot thinkings, that's available through your website, Brian, at Paragean Technologies. Is that correct?
It is. Yep. It's also on Amazon as well, but
okay.
Folks can come to the website and order it there. It's the first product we've ever had. Again, we do lots of workshops in CTA. I've, written a book and that sort of thing, but this is the first attempt of bringing some of this NDM stuff into places where we are not. And hopefully we'll see more of this going forward.
Absolutely. As you're talking about this tool, the one thing that jumped out at me immediately, because I have an anathema against downtime in training. And it's one of the things that I still hear trainers talk about is, well, we have so much downtime because we've got this scenario and we've got 3 or 4 officers going through the scenario and 12 are sitting on their butts doing nothing for 15 or 20 minutes. I'm thinking, as you're talking about this, I'm going like, what a great tool to break those people down into a group and have them quickly go through this and just build those cognitive skills. What a great way to do that.
Yeah, people get real competitive. They have a lot of fun with it, right? Especially the senior folks, because they want to make that scenario as hard as possible, but still realistic, right? So we've seen a lot of people get really competitive about it. And you're right. Yeah, it's for downtime, or even, when we talk to some military trainers, they call it hip pocket training, right? Something you can just pull out at any downtime and just run, because it doesn't require a whole lot of preparation. But yeah, it's been a lot of fun watching people sort of go through it. And you can cycle through pretty quickly. I mean, sessions will usually go 30, 45 minutes, but you just start a new one and you just ramp back up and you're in a whole new training environment.
Right. Awesome. Brian, how can our listeners get in touch with you if they want to find out more about Paragean Technologies or more about CTA? How can they get in touch with you?
Yeah, so the 3 things they can look at. Our website is Paragean, Perigean technologies.com. Got a lot of publications on there as well. You'll see the plot thinkings. And a bunch of the case studies, some of which I've talked about today of our work. The Naturalistic Decision Making Association is at naturalisticdecisionmaking.org. There you can go learn more about the broader community, hear our podcasts, and ideally get involved. We're going to have our next conference is in 2026 at the University of Virginia in Charlottesville, Virginia in the U.S. We do conferences every other year, and we get folks from all over the world, from all different kinds of domains, and who are both, researchers and or practitioners in the domain. So we would love to have a law enforcement presence at the next conference. And then the CTA, we do have an institute. It's at cta.institute. And it is the only place folks can go at this time to get any sort of CTA training. We have a 12-hour self-study course, which is going to introduce you in more detail to some of the things I've talked about today. So yeah, we're out there. I'm also on Twitter at or X, I guess it's called now, at Paragean, and of course on LinkedIn as well. So connect with me there.
Fantastic. Brian, thanks so much for taking the time to talk to us, and we do look forward to having you back on again.
Great. Thanks for having me, Chris.
Well, we hope that you've enjoyed this episode of the Trainers Bullpen. And as always, our encouragement to you is that you would reflect deeply about the critical aspects of this interview and how you can apply the principles that you heard to advance your training and make your students more effective and adaptive performers in the real world. As a reminder, all of the research papers, as well as the other links, are available to you over at the Trainers Bullpen website at trainersbullpen.com. Thank you for your dedication to advancing officer and public safety.